She was a queen draped in jewels, but her throne was built on blood. Those who entered her bedchamber often left in pieces, fed to the beasts she loved more than men. The courtyard was silent but for the dogs. Their chains rattled in the moonlight, their low growls echoing against the stone walls of the palace. Torchlight flickered on their eyes that burned like embers, fixed on the feast they knew was coming. Guards dragged the body of a man across the cobblestones, his silks torn, his blood leaving a trail behind him. He had once been a noble, a lover whispered about in the candlelit halls of the Queen's chamber. Now he was nothing more than meat for her hounds. The Queen watched from her balcony, her figure framed in golden shadow. Jewels glittered at her throat, her crown caught the torchlight, and yet her gaze was fixed only on the spectacle below. She raised her hand ever so slightly and the guards obeyed. With a shove, the body fell before the cages. The dogs lunged, snarling, tearing into flesh with a frenzy that made even seasoned soldiers avert their eyes. Witnesses swore they saw her smile. Not the soft smile of a woman, nor the triumphant smirk of a ruler, but the cold satisfaction of a predator who had fed her beasts once more. Rumours spread quickly through the palace. They whispered that every man who shared her bed risked never leaving it alive, that in the morning their remains would not be found in the chambers of state, but in the bellies of her hounds. Some said she trained the beasts herself, whispering to them like children, rewarding them with morsels of meat until they recognized her signal. Others swore she called them by name, each dog more loyal to her than any minister, more trusted than any guard. To the nobles she was both temptation and terror. They longed for her beauty, her touch, her favour, yet they feared her silken bed as much as they feared the dungeon. For in her palace, the line between a lover and a victim was drawn in blood. She was a queen, yes, crowned by power, wrapped in wealth, worshipped by courtiers who dared not disobey. But beneath the silk and jewels she was something else entirely, a hunter, and where other rulers used assassins, armies, or poison, she used teeth. This is not the story of a romance. This is not the story of a dynasty. This is the story of a queen who murdered her lovers and fed them to her dogs. Monsters are not always born. Sometimes they are made, shaped by cruelty, ambition, and the hunger for power. The queen, whose name history buried in scandal, began her life not as a tyrant, but as a child in a court that valued bloodlines over innocence, obedience over love. She was born into a house of daggers. Her father, a ruthless noble, ruled his estate with iron and lash. Her mother, cold and calculating, taught her daughter early that beauty was not a gift, but a weapon, sharper than any blade if wielded with precision. From the time she could walk, she was dressed in silks too heavy for her small frame, paraded before foreign envoys like a jewel to be admired, a bargaining chip to be bartered. Childhood was brief. She saw servants beaten to death for the smallest errors. She watched brothers sent away as hostages, pawns in games of alliance. She learned that kindness had no place in palaces where smiles hid daggers and wine concealed poison. By her teenage years, she had already mastered the art of silence, of hiding her thoughts behind eyes that revealed nothing. There were stories, rumours of her cruelty, even as a girl. A handmaiden's rabbit found gutted and left on the steps of the chapel. A stable boy who vanished after mocking her. His blood discovered in the straw of the kennels. Some claimed she was already practicing, already learning to control life and death, testing how fear could bend people to her will. When she came of age, her beauty was undeniable. Men described her hair as sunlight woven into silk, her eyes as storms barely contained. She laughed rarely, but when she did, it was enough to ensnare the hearts of nobles twice her age. Yet beauty alone was not enough. She had been taught by her mother that survival depended on more than charm. It depended on control. Marriage placed her directly on the throne. The king, older and weary, saw in her not only youth, but a chance to secure his legacy. To the court, she was the perfect bride, elegant, pious in ceremony, graceful in appearance. But behind the closed doors of the palace she began her quiet ascent. She studied the politics of her new realm with predatory focus. She learned which ministers coveted power, which generals feared disgrace, which courtiers whispered in corners. She played the part of the obedient queen, nodding in silence while her husband made decrees. But her eyes lingered on the weak spots, the cracks she could one day pry open. What set her apart, however, was not merely her ambition. It was her fascination with dominance, her belief that to control a man completely, one must own not just his loyalty, but his flesh, his breath, his final scream. Lovers came to her chambers in secret, intoxicated by her beauty and her promises. They expected warmth, perhaps even love. Instead, they found themselves caught in a trap spun tighter than any spider's web. Some historians argue that her cruelty was born of childhood trauma, the echoes of a loveless youth shaping her into something unrecognizable. Others believe it was simple power lust, sharpened by the knowledge that as a woman in a world of kings, her beauty was her weapon, and her body her battlefield. But the truth is likely both. Pain and ambition fused into a single, monstrous will. And so, the girl raised in shadows became the queen who ruled through fear. Her jewels sparkled like the stars, but her heart beat in time, with the growls of the hounds she raised, fed and adored. Where others found companionship in people, she found it in beasts, creatures as loyal to her as men never could be. The making of the monster was complete. All that remained was for the world to realize it. When her lovers began to vanish and the kennels filled with the sound of feasting, the queen's power was not written in laws or sealed in decrees, it was woven in whispers and silk. She ruled not through open proclamations, but through the most ancient form of influence, seduction. The court was a hive of intrigue, filled with men who believed themselves masters of strategy, generals hardened by war, ministers sharpened by politics. Yet in her presence, their armor cracked. She had perfected the art of allure, wielding beauty like a blade. She did not smile often, but when she did, it was calculated. A glance held a heartbeat too long, a word spoken in a voice soft enough to make powerful men lean closer. In the candlelit chambers of the palace, she built a theatre of secrets. Hidden passages connected her private rooms to secluded gardens, where lovers could slip unseen beneath the moon. Her maids carried letters sealed not with the royal crest, but with drops of perfumed wax, messages written in coded phrases that only those she favoured could decipher. To the outside world, she was the embodiment of grace. Within the shadows, she was a siren weaving a web of desire. The nobles whispered of her midnight invitations. A hand resting lightly on a goblet, a look across a crowded hall, was enough to ignite weeks of speculation. To be chosen by her was both triumph and terror. Triumph, because her favour could elevate even a minor lord into influence overnight. Terror, because everyone knew her affections did not last, and her discarded lovers had a way of vanishing without a trace. Still, they came to her, willingly, recklessly. Ambition dulled their fear. To lie in the queen's bed was to taste forbidden power. Her chambers became a sanctum of secrets, its walls lined with velvet, its air thick with incense, its silence broken only by whispers and the distant growls of her hounds. Some men swore they never felt more alive than when her hand lingered on theirs, even knowing it might be the last touch they'd ever feel. She used these encounters not only for pleasure, but for information. In the dark, her lovers spoke freely, boasting of wealth, betraying rivalries, confessing ambitions. Each word they gave her became a weapon she could use. In the morning, she would rise from the silk sheets with more than just a lover's memory. She carried secrets that allowed her to manipulate the court with surgical precision. The danger of her allure was compounded by her unpredictability. To some, she was tender, murmuring promises of loyalty and love. To others, she was distant, making them chase a warmth she never intended to give. The uncertainty bound them tighter than chains. They were moths drawn to fire, unable to resist even as their wings burned. But the whispers did not remain confined to her chamber. Servants spoke of the shadows that slipped into her rooms at night. Ladies-in-waiting exchanged rumours of her laughter echoing long past midnight, laughter that sounded more like triumph than joy. Priests muttered of sin, warning, that no queen should wield her body as a weapon. Yet even those priests lowered their voices, for none dared to accuse her openly. Her reputation grew paradoxically with each disappearance. When a courtier vanished after an evening at her side, the whispers only heightened her mystique. Some claimed it was proof of her cruelty. Others secretly believed it proof of her power, that she could take men into her chamber and decide whether they would rise higher than ever before or fall into oblivion. The palace became a stage, and she its star performer. Each glance, each gesture, each night spent behind locked doors added to the legend. Men knew the danger, they knew the risks, yet still they pursued her, captivated by the possibility that they might be the one to survive her embrace. It was seduction as strategy, intimacy as weapon, and it was only the beginning. For soon, the whispers of her affairs would become screams when passion gave way to blood, and lovers who entered her chamber never walked out again. Every legend has a beginning, and hers began with blood. The Queen's first killing was not planned as carefully as those that followed. It was born of fear, desperation, and the sudden realization that the easiest way to silence a threat was to erase it. The story goes that her first lover was not a noble, but a young knight of the guard, bold, foolish, and intoxicated by her beauty. For weeks he had stolen into her chamber under the veil of midnight, certain that his secret was safe. But passion makes men careless. He began to boast in the barracks, hinting at stolen kisses and whispered vows, letting his comrades believe he was the Queen's chosen companion. In a court where words were weapons, his boasts were daggers pointed at her throne. When the Queen heard of his indiscretion, she did not weep or plead. She summoned him one final time. He entered her chamber that night smiling, thinking himself triumphant. She greeted him as always, her touch soft, her voice honeyed. But waiting outside the door were guards she had handpicked, men loyal only to her. As dawn broke, the knight's body was dragged from her bedchamber, not to the gallows or the dungeons, but to the kennels. The palace servants who watched never forgot what followed. The Queen stood at the edge of the courtyard, her hands folded in calm composure, while the body of her knight was thrown before her hounds. The beasts lunged with savage hunger, teeth tearing into flesh, their snarls echoing through the morning air. Some said she looked away. Others swore she watched every moment, her eyes cold, her lips curved in something dangerously close to satisfaction. The official story declared the knight guilty of treason, executed swiftly for plotting against the crown. His comrades in the guard were silenced by threats of death, but whispers travelled faster than decrees. The courtiers knew the truth. He had betrayed not the king, but the Queen, and for that betrayal he had been fed to her dogs. That first act set a precedent. What began as necessity soon became ritual. Each time she felt threatened, by betrayal, by loose tongues, by the arrogance of men who thought her theirs. She answered not with banishment, not with poison, but with the same brutal spectacle. The kennels became the stage of her vengeance, the hounds her executioners. Her victims changed in rank but not in fate. A minister who lingered too long over her smile, a lord who tried to demand more than she would give, a page caught slipping a note meant for another man. One by one they disappeared into her shadow, and one by one the growls of her dogs announced their end. For the servants forced to witness it, the horror became unbearable. Some fainted at the sight, others prayed desperately as the hounds feasted, but none dared refuse her command. Even the handlers who raised the beasts obeyed with trembling hands, knowing that a single hesitation might see them thrown to the animals they had trained. The Queen had discovered something intoxicating, the power not only to destroy her enemies, but to make their destruction unforgettable. Execution by sword or noose left a corpse to mourn, a body to bury. But the dogs left nothing but bones, nothing but terror. From that moment she ceased to be merely a queen who ruled by decree. She became a figure of dread, a woman whose lovers entered her chambers at their peril, and the palace itself seemed to hold its breath, as if the stones remembered the screams of the men whose blood had seeped into them. The first killing had been a response to danger. The next would be an assertion of power. Soon it would become a pattern, and her legend as the queen who fed her lovers to her hounds would take root in history. The first death could have been dismissed as necessity, a single act buried beneath excuses of treason and secrecy. But patterns are not born of one crime. They emerge when shadows begin to repeat themselves, when whispers refuse to fade. And in the Queen's palace, the pattern of death grew impossible to ignore. At first, her lovers still came willingly, blinded by desire and ambition. The court was filled with young nobles desperate for her smile, ministers craving her favour, guards intoxicated by the thought of touching what was forbidden. They told themselves they would be different, that they would win her trust, her love, her permanence. But every man believed he was special right up until the moment the kennels roared with hunger. The Queen refined her ritual with terrifying precision. No longer did she rely on rash commands or impulsive executions. She orchestrated everything like theatre. A lover would be drawn into her chamber, lulled by wine, song and silk. She would whisper promises of loyalty, even of marriage. Then, when he was certain he held her heart, the mask would slip. Guards hidden in shadows would emerge. The man would be dragged away, often struggling, screaming, begging for mercy. His cries would echo through the palace corridors until they were swallowed by the snarls of her hounds. She never denied herself the satisfaction of attending. Witnesses claimed she stood in her balcony above the kennels, her figure haloed by torchlight, watching as the beast tore apart the very men who had sworn eternal devotion to her. Sometimes she laughed. Sometimes she raised her hand in blessing, as if presiding over a sacrament. And sometimes she remained perfectly silent, her face an unreadable mask as flesh was reduced to nothing but bones. Soon, the deaths took on a rhythm, as predictable as the tolling of church bells. 1 month it was a foreign envoy who lingered too long at her side. Another, a lord who dared demand she grant him lands as the price of his affection. Then, a soldier who boasted drunkenly of her touch. Each disappearance was explained away with excuses, treason, illness, sudden journeys abroad. But everyone knew the truth. The Queen's bed was a doorway, and beyond it lay the jaws of her hounds. Fear spread like rot through the court. Men began to weigh her glance like a death sentence. Was her invitation a gift or a curse? Nobles avoided her eyes, terrified of being chosen, yet equally terrified of being overlooked. Rumours multiplied in the shadows, that she smeared her lips with the blood of her victims, that she whispered their names to her dogs before sleep, that she wore jewels fashioned from their bones. Her dogs themselves became creatures of legend. Massive beasts bred for hunting and war, they prowled the palace grounds like demons loosed from hell. Their eyes glowed in torchlight, their growls echoed through the night. To hear them was to remember the men they had devoured. Servants began crossing, themselves at the sound, whispering prayers as though the hounds were spirits rather than flesh. And yet, still the lovers came. Such was the power of her beauty, such was the intoxication of power, that ambition outweighed terror. Men told themselves that the rumours were lies spread by jealous rivals. They convinced themselves they could succeed where others had failed. Desire blinded them, and the Queen fed on their blindness. The pattern was set. Seduction, betrayal, execution by beast. Again and again the cycle repeated, until the palace itself seemed to throb with the memory of it. And as each man vanished, the Queen's legend grew darker, her power more absolute. She was no longer simply a ruler. She was a predator cloaked in silk, a sovereign whose kisses led to kennels, whose love ended in blood. The court lived in fear, yet no one dared confront her. For in a world ruled by crowns and daggers, it was safer to let the dogs feast than to risk becoming their next meal. The palace was not the only place haunted by the Queen's reign of blood. Word spread quickly beyond its gilded gates, carried by servants, merchants, and trembling envoys who returned home with stories too strange to be inventions. Before long, the entire kingdom pulsed with fear. In the city below, taverns buzzed with whispers of the Queen who fed her lovers to dogs. Peasants huddled by firelight, reciting the tales in hushed voices, as though speaking her name too loudly might summon her hounds. Mothers warned their sons not to chase the temptations of wealth or beauty, lest they end as meat beneath royal teeth. Children dared one another to approach the palace walls at night, pressing their ears against the stone to hear the low growl of beasts still hungry for flesh. In the countryside, the queen's legend twisted into prophecy. Priests thundered from pulpits that her cruelty was proof of divine punishment looming over the land. Some declared her possessed, an agent of hell cloaked in jewels. Others whispered she was immortal, her beauty preserved only by the blood she offered to her hounds. Fear made the common people pious, and prayers against the queen's curse rose louder with each passing month. Within the palace, terror was even sharper. Courtiers lived in a constant state of calculation. Every glance, every word weighed for how it might be interpreted. To be summoned to her chamber was both triumph and doom. Nobles who once vied for her favour now crossed themselves when her gaze lingered on them. Ministers spoke in riddles, careful never to reveal too much, knowing that secrets spoken in her presence often became confessions whispered to the dogs. Even the king, old, tired, and overshadowed by his wife's ferocity, seemed powerless. Some claimed he was blind to her crimes, cocooned in luxury and denial. Others insisted he knew but tolerated it, preferring to let his queen cull his rivals in ways his hands could not be stained. Whatever the truth, his silence became complicity. To the people, he was no longer sovereign. She was. Foreign courts reacted with horror. Ambassadors returned home shaken, reporting not just on treaties and taxes, but on the growls echoing through the Queen's palace at night. Rumours spread across borders that she had turned her kennels into a throne room of death. Some neighbouring rulers threatened war, claiming her reign was a blight upon Christendom. Others, more fearful than outraged, simply sent no more envoys at all, unwilling to risk their men vanishing into her silk-draped snare. But fear, paradoxically, fed her power. For in terror there is submission, and in submission there is control. No noble dared plot openly against her. No servant dared refuse her orders. Her reputation alone silenced rebellion before it could begin. She was no longer merely queen. She was myth, nightmare, prophecy. To resist her was to resist inevitability itself. Yet cracks formed in the silence. Some courtiers began to collect evidence, passing whispers in coded words, leaving notes hidden beneath chapel pews. Priests, though frightened, began recording tales of her cruelty in secret chronicles. Even among her servants, loyalty grew thin. For though fear bound their tongues, their eyes had seen too much. The shredded bodies dragged through corridors, the growls that followed each midnight visitor. Fear gave her power, but fear also planted seeds of resistance. Still, the kingdom waited. Every day the queen appeared in court, draped in silk and jewels, her dogs at her heels, eyes sharp as blades. Every day the people prayed for deliverance, and every night the palace trembled with the sound of chains rattling, of beasts fed, of secrets swallowed in the darkness. The kingdom was hers, but it was a kingdom built not on loyalty or love. It was a kingdom built on terror, ruled not by crown or sceptre, but by teeth. For years, fear alone was enough to shield the queen, but no reign of terror lasts forever. Secrets, like blood, have a way of seeping through cracks, staining even the most carefully polished stone, and in time, the pattern she had perfected became too blatant, too impossible to conceal. It began with whispers among the servants. For all their fear, they were the ones who scrubbed blood from marble floors, who carried garments stained with crimson to the fire pits, who heard the screams muffled by palace walls. Each disappearance left behind traces too numerous to erase. A wine goblet dropped in panic, torn silk buried hastily, bones carried from the kennels beneath cloaks. These fragments wove together into a story that could no longer be silenced. The first to speak were not nobles but priests. Confessors began recording strange testimonies from terrified courtiers, dreams of dogs tearing flesh, voices whispering in the night, visions of fire and blood. At first, the clergy dismissed them as symptoms of fear, but when different men described the same horrors, suspicion hardened into certainty. Some priests believed the queen had bound herself to dark powers, her beauty preserved through sacrifice, her rule upheld not by God but by demons wearing the skins of hounds. Then came the missing envoy. A foreign ambassador, bold enough to think himself untouchable, vanished after attending one of her feasts. His attendants waited in vain for his return. When pressed, the Queen's court claimed he had fallen ill and died suddenly of fever. Yet his body was never returned, his possessions quietly seized, his name struck from records. That disappearance was not so easily buried. Rumours crossed borders, and foreign rulers demanded answers. Within her own palace, fear curdled into plotting. Ministers who had once turned blind eyes began to consider their own survival. What if her wrath turned against them? What if their sons were next to vanish into her silken web? Quiet alliances formed in shadowed corridors, letters exchanged in cipher, guarded meetings held in the chapels at night. They needed evidence strong enough to expose her, not just whispers, not just rumours, but proof. Proof came from the kennels. One moonless night, a servant brave, or foolish, enough to slip past the guards, discovered what none dared say aloud. Bones, human bones, littered the straw, gnawed clean but unmistakable. Rings still clung to skeletal fingers, teeth gleamed among the refuse. The servant fled with a ring clasped tight in his palm, a signet once worn by a noble who had mysteriously disappeared months earlier. The discovery spread like fire through the court, passed hand to hand, each noble staring into the horror they had long suspected but never dared confront. The queen sensed the shift before it was spoken. She saw the way courtiers avoided her eyes, the way conversations fell silent as she entered a room. Her hounds, once symbols of her terror, were now evidence of her guilt. Where once their snarls commanded obedience, now they stirred whispers of rebellion. Her downfall accelerated when one of her own guards defected. Haunted by the screams he had heard, unable to wash the blood from his memory, he confessed before a council of nobles. His words were damning. He had seen lovers dragged from her chambers, he had carried bodies to the kennels, he had watched the queen herself signal the release of the dogs. His testimony stripped away the last veil of doubt. The trap closed quickly after that. Ministers demanded her arrest, priests thundered of exorcism, foreign envoys threatened war if justice was not done. The king, cornered and humiliated, had no choice but to act. For years he had allowed silence to protect him, but now silence threatened his crown. To save himself, he condemned his queen. Her reign of terror, built on seduction and blood, was collapsing. The same whispers that once fed her power now turned against her, rising into shouts of accusation. The predator was about to become prey. The trial of the queen was unlike any spectacle her kingdom had ever seen. For years she had ruled the court with whispers and terror, but now every eye in the realm turned toward her, not in fear, but in hunger, for justice, for vengeance, for blood. She was brought into the great hall at dawn, chained in gold as if mockery itself were her captor. Her gown was stripped of jewels, her hair undone, yet even diminished she radiated a terrible beauty. Some swore she walked with her head high, her lips curled into a smile that mocked the nobles who dared accuse her. Others whispered that she looked like a lioness in a cage, prowling, waiting for the moment to strike. The charges were read aloud by trembling priests: adultery, treason, witchcraft, and above all murder. Each word echoed across the stone walls like a curse. Witnesses stepped forward, servants pale with terror, guards who could no longer silence their memories, priests who claimed to have seen her shadow walking by torchlight as dogs feasted in the kennels. They spoke of bones found in straw, of rings carried from refuse, of cries that pierced the night. The court gasped as a servant presented the most damning evidence: the signet ring of a nobleman who had vanished months before, found gnawed among the kennels. The weight of proof, undeniable and grotesque, hung in the air like smoke. Yet the queen did not tremble. When her turn came to speak, her words cut sharper than any blade. She laughed at her accusers, her voice ringing through the hall with scorn. "You call it murder? I call it justice. Men swore their devotion and broke their oaths. I gave them to beasts more loyal than they. Who among you would not feed treachery to the dogs?" Gasps filled the chamber. Some nobles crossed themselves, others stared at her with a mixture of awe and revulsion. Her defiance only deepened her damnation. For though she tried to twist her cruelty into righteousness, all saw now that she had no remorse, no shame. The priest declared her possessed by demons, her beauty a mask for corruption. Nobles shouted for her death, demanding the cleansing of the throne. The king, silent and pale, listened as his ministers turned on the woman who had ruled beside him. At last, cornered by outrage and bound by evidence, He raised his hand and pronounced her sentence, death. But how should a queen who fed men to dogs be executed? Some called for burning, others for hanging, still others for dismemberment. In the end, the sentence carried its own cruel irony. She would be thrown to the very beast she had nurtured, devoured by the hounds that had once obeyed only her. When the judgment was read, the queen did not beg. She did not cry. She smiled. Then at least, she said, I shall not die alone. My children will feast on me, as they feasted on the men who betrayed me. Her words chilled the hall into silence, priests clutching their crosses, nobles pale with dread. The trial ended not with cheers, but with uneasy quiet. For though justice had been pronounced, no one felt safe. They knew they had condemned not just a woman, but a legend, one that would stalk them long after her body was gone. Her body was gone, torn apart by the very hounds she once commanded, but her shadow never left the palace. The queen who murdered her lovers and fed them to dogs was buried in earth, yet her story lived on in whispers, curses and warnings carved into memory. For the nobles, she became a cautionary tale about unchecked desire. Men remembered the silken invitations, the soft glances across banquet halls, and the screams that followed. In later years they spoke of her not as a woman, but as a spectre of temptation, the queen whose beauty devoured as surely as her beasts. Among the people, her legend grew darker still. They said her soul did not rest, that at night the palace echoed with the rattling of chains and the low growl of phantom dogs. Travellers swore that if you passed near the old kennels at midnight, you could hear her laughter carried on the wind, followed by the snap of jaws. Mothers frightened children into obedience by whispering, "Sleep, or the queen's hounds will find you." Historians tried to tame her story, reducing her to a footnote, an infamous monarch who strayed too far into cruelty. But legends resist cages. She was remembered not as a failed wife or a dethroned queen, but as a predator cloaked in silk, who ruled through fear and teeth. In the end, her legacy was not written in decrees or treaties. It was written in blood, in bones buried beneath straw, in the terror that lingered long after her throne was empty. Even now, centuries later, the tale endures, a queen whose crown was power, whose throne was terror, and whose empire was fed to the dogs. She was remembered not as a queen of nations, but as a queen of beasts, who fed her heart's desires to the jaws of hounds.